I'd like to welcome everybody today to another Q&A presentation. Today we're going to have Gary Giumarra talk to us about Operation Sledgehammer. The question being whether or not Sledgehammer was a feasible amphibious operation. And I think most people here are aware that historically the historiography on Operation Sledgehammer is largely negative. It's a foregone conclusion in most histories that you read that it was not a feasible operation of war. And I think Gary's going to address that perception today, and I'm looking forward to hear what he has to say. Actually, I know what he's going to have to say because this is a re-recording. I omitted to record the original presentation for the first couple of minutes, so this is going to be a slight redo, and Gary's going to talk about the first 5 minutes, which I failed to record. Gary's got an MA in military history from the American Military University. He's been studying this operation for several years now, and I'm familiar with some of his thoughts, and I'm really looking forward to this, and I'm looking forward to hearing how people have to say about it. So with that, Gary, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, and you can go ahead and start the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Vince, and thanks again for giving me this opportunity, and the WHNA for giving me the opportunity to give you a summation of some of the conclusions that I've acquired along the way during my research into Operation Sledgehammer. As Vince has already mentioned, this is kind of a redo, so I hope it flows relatively seamlessly from this redo of the first part into the balance of the presentation. So I guess where I wanted to pick up on the whole question was to kind of put it in context of 1942, when you heard the cry in the streets and there was a lot of propaganda posters and pamphlets. Second front now was what was on the lips of many citizens on both sides of the Atlantic. This happens to show a demonstration from Trafalgar Square. There were no such mass demonstrations, as far as I know, in the United States. But there was a lot of opinion in editorials, even in Gallup surveys that tended to push for an early attack against Hitler's empire in Europe by American and British forces, even as early as 1942. So it was on the agenda. It was something that people talked about. It was in the news. It was in the commentary. But there were, on the British side of the equation, the two most important figures who would be deciding on weighing in on the decision was, of course, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and then his chief military officer for the British Army, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, Field Marshal Alan Brooke. Both of them were of the opinion that an operation, a cross-channel attack, which is essentially what Second Front meant at 1942 and later on, was well beyond infeasible. It was not really something to be seriously considered as being feasible. And they, of course, especially Churchill, had an outside role in sort of doing the first draft on the history of World War II in his Nobel Prize winning multi-volume history of World War II that sort of set the tone for, I believe, a lot of other historians taking the cue from him, but also independently, to be fair. And of course, Brooke himself weighed in on the subject many times. His diaries were published in sort of edited form in the 50s, and then more recently in an unedited form. And he's very clear in his opposition and his to any such undertaking. Strangely enough, on the other side of the Pacific, the Atlantic, excuse me, were the American actors that were quite eager from quite early on to undertake a cross-channel attack. Even as early as you see a quote here from an up-and-coming officer who was quite obscure at the time, but obviously became quite famous very quickly, and that was Dwight Eisenhower. We've got to get to Europe and fight. We've got to stop wasting resources all over the world, and still worse, wasting time. And that was definitely the view of his superior and sort of champion, chief of the U.S. General Staff, George Marshall, and his boss, putatively, the U.S. Secretary of War, Henry Stimson. They were both very eager and emphatic that something should be attempted in 1942. And this was something I really wasn't aware of when I first came into the, I had a fair background in World War II history, but I wasn't really aware of how vociferously the War Department in the United States, the upper reaches of the War Department were, how vociferously they advocated such an undertaking, which I think to a lot of people that have, even a passing knowledge of World War II history, much less experts, would have seemed, somewhat astonishing that they would even consider such an undertaking of that nature. But really their goals were twofold. One was they felt it was vital, and I think this is indisputable, that the Soviet Union be kept in the war against Germany. That any chance that the Red Army would be put out of combat would have just devastating long-term consequences. And the other objective, which you see from Stimson through Marshall, Eisenhower, and other figures in the War Department, was to head off what they saw as a dispersion of efforts, as the different commanders and the different theaters made demands on common resources, and they really were desirous to concentrate as much of the resources, as much as the common war effort in one area as possible, and so as to head off that dispersion, and which is indeed what happened. Once Sledgehammer didn't go forward, I think, and we'll talk about more later on, that is actually what did happen. And so, as Vince mentioned already, the post-war consensus has been overwhelmingly negative that any such undertaking in 1942, such as Sledgehammer, was just doomed to failure. So here's a few quotes. Quixotic, its feasibility was a myth. It was even suicidal. And I'd say other historians have used terminology maybe not quite as charged as that, but I would say it's virtually universal. The judgment's virtually universal that something like an early Second Front in 1942 was out of the question. Okay, but what these historians have failed to take into consideration is really the German side of the equation. And that is basically, an early second front, namely a second front in 1942, a cross-channel invasion in 1942 was actually what Hitler feared the most at the time. He held a series of 3 conferences in August and September of 1942, which, retrospectively have been named the Atlantic Wall Conferences, because that's where he initiated and sort of furthered his ideas. So I have some points here. These are all Hitler's points. If you look at the transcripts, it's 100% Hitler. If there were any questions back and forth, they're not captured in the transcripts. But basically, he had studied the problem, and he saw that the coastal defensive positions were weak and insufficient. It consisted of a bunch of small little, what they were called resistance nests, that, and they're not like what we conceive of when we think of Overlord. They weren't concrete bunkers. They were just open field works with just, 30 to 40 men in each one of these so-called resistance nests, Widerstandnesten. He said they lacked 8 to 12 divisions needed for a continuous defense. That he could only spare negligible forces from the main front in the east, and that's he constantly reinforced the realities that the main battle had to be on the eastern front, that he could not spare, and that was the locus of his concern, was that he really couldn't spare anything from the east. And obviously the opening of a second front, even if it was relatively small, would necessarily drain critical strength from his fight with Soviet Russia. Here's this kind of surprising statement for those who've touched on the subject. And he claims that the Luftwaffe suffered from absolute inferiority in the West. That's actually an accurate statement. And as we will see, pretty much everybody knew that at the time. For some reason, historians in the meantime don't see that clearly, or at least most of them. The historians that have looked into the subject have, validated that. He was afraid of French sabotage, because sabotage had already been going on. I mean, it's just not only on the railroads, but also, reports of cable sabotage. If you just look, leafing through some of the reports, it's just a routine thing that would be how many cables were cut this week and how many cables were cut last week. It just happened continuously. Obviously, the transportation sabotage is more important. And he was afraid in case of an invasion that the French railroad workers would either outright sabotage or just wouldn't show up. And obviously the Germans really relied on the rail transportation for their military movement. He couldn't be sure what France was going to do in his rear. Remember, there's still Vichy France at the time, okay? Whatever you might think of the regime, the Vichy regime, Hitler never liked nor trusted Pétain. And I think in that case, he probably, I don't think there was ever any real chance that they would have done anything, but there were certainly many leading figures in the French military, the Vichy French military, that were either angling or preparing to rejoin the fight on the side of the Allies. I think that there's lots and lots of evidence of that. That's not to say they would have succeeded. That's not to say they would have been affected things positively in the Allies. That's a complex question, but they certainly, his fears in that respect were not totally unfounded. And this is something I really want to emphasize. We are going to be talking a lot about land warfare here. And I know this is a naval history group. So I just want to emphasize that really this next point, which is he's mentioned you cannot be sure that any given landing is the main one. I'm showing here also a picture of the commander in the West The command was also known as OB West. That's von Rundstedt, and he was of the same mind. And basically, this is the I think this is the orientation that I think a lot of historians fail to see. If you're sitting on their side of the channel and you know that the other side can land anywhere at any time, it makes your job extremely difficult. Plus, both Hitler and Rundstedt pretty significantly overstated or overestimated what they felt were the Allied capabilities. So basically, and this attitude continued on through Overlord, and you can see it many times there, but it didn't start with Operation Fortitude. It was sort of baked into the cake already. So there was kind of this attitude that wherever the first landing is, it's maybe and maybe even probably not the real Großlandung. It's not the main one. Okay, so you can even see in the wake of in the hours following the the Dieppe operation, the first thing Rundstedt sends out to all his divisions is this is a Täuschungsoperation. It's a deception operation. That's what we're going to say. Well, of course it wasn't. Plus there was this report there was 26 large ships near the Isle of Wight waiting to follow up, which of course those never existed. So I'm not sure if that was part of some British deception. I've never read about it one way or another. I read about it in several documents on the German side. I've never heard anything about it with respect to Operation Jubilee, the Dieppe raid on the British side, but that was widely believed. There was another follow-up operation going to happen for at least the initial hours of the raid. Hitler said that the enemy could land 300,000 men in 3,000 to 4,000 landing craft in just 2 to 3 days. So there's an example of the gross overestimation of Allied capabilities. I mean, I guess I am going to be talking about the fact that the capacity to land troops on the French shoreline was much greater than a lot of other historians have given it credit for, but it's certainly not in that range by a long shot. Rundstedt also in his weekly reports back to Berlin mentions that in his mind the British could continue had developed technical means. I'm assuming advanced landing craft. Maybe he's referring to the LCTs that he's seen in the photo reconnaissance or whatever. But that they could continue to mount operations over beaches, amphibious operations, far past or in weather conditions that weren't heretofore possible. He also says that based on, this is now their third fall on the Channel coast, and he is firmly convinced that based on the weather conditions they've seen in the previous 2 seasons, that operations are certainly viable, even notwithstanding the technical improvements through October at least, and maybe even November. So Hitler also says the establishment of the Second Front is the Allies' sole chance for victory. So if you turn that around, it's basically his way of saying, this is the only way I can lose. Obviously, he's wrong about that because no Second Front came at that time. It wouldn't come for another 20 months. But that was his conviction. So he even sort of dramatically states it in the last of he sort of opens it. And this is one place in the transcripts, which are usually just paraphrases, where they actually quote Hitler verbatim, where he says, he's never capitulated in the past, but now he must openly admit that a second front in Europe would bring us to an absolutely critical situation. So that just shows you his impression of the situation, some of which I think is well-grounded, and others obviously is not, but also in some ways works to the Allies' advantage. Sorry for the green here. I couldn't figure out how to get that. I copied this from another application, but this is kind of a rundown of of the coastal divisions. I'm not expecting you to take those all in. But I just want to quickly show you that most of them are these 300 and 700 series, what are called bodenständig or static divisions. The 300 divisions are more or less smallish divisions of less than 9,000 men, though they do have 9 infantry battalions. They're less well equipped. They're usually equipped with captured artillery, for instance. Sometimes even most of their anti-tank weaponry is captured. A lot of their machine guns is captured weapons. They're not very well trained, and they really have almost no motor transport. So they are truly static. They're not. They really cannot operate. They're not organized. They're not trained, and they're not equipped to operate outside of their static coastal positions. There's also a number of 700 series, which are similar but even lower quality. They're really more the size of reinforced brigades. So if you take a quick glance at that left-hand column or the second column on the left, you will see that almost every division on the coast is either a 300 or 700 series division. There's only 2 standard infantry divisions, both of them recycled from the East Coast. When they came back, they were in pretty sorry shape, but by this point in time, they probably are reasonably, well conditioned. But as you can see, one's at Calais, so it's unlikely to move. So anyway, the average coastal frontage is 84 miles. That's a lot for one division. This is a little peek ahead, a little snapshot of a coastal area. Hint, hint, this is where they're planning. This is where, when the discussions come to a head, this is where the plans say they're going to land. I know it's hard to make heads or tails with all that scribbling on it and such, but those are basically individual weapons. That's about a 2.5 mile stretch of land, or beachfront. As you can see at the bottom there, and each one of those circles are the resistance nests that Hitler complained were weaker and insufficient. And you can see even there at the bottom, there's a 1 mile stretch. Those thick black lines are a divisional boundary. And I know from the maps from the other division that there is a small resistance nest right there on the beach, right at the boundary. But there's still a gap of almost a mile that's basically unprotected. And even if the so-called strong points there, the resistance nests, relatively speaking, are not, that represents just a little more than 1 platoon, maybe 60 or 70 men in both of those put together, in both those resistance nests put together. So not a very strong coastal defense. Okay, so I want to jump back. We got down in the detail there. Let's jump back to the bigger strategic situation for Germany in 1942. And I think this is, again, something I think you see in a lot of history books, but it's not really incorporated in a meaningful way in the discussion of the early Second Front discussion. So obviously over the previous campaign season, there was massive losses of men and material, 1 million casualties is the number it's thrown around. But I think that the part that really is not, it's there in the history if you're looking for it, but I don't think it's really penetrated into discussion, is that Germany was not ready for a protracted war. The whole idea behind Blitzkrieg was short, sharp, quick resolution. They felt they were going to beat the Soviet Union in a matter of weeks or a few months at the most. Indeed, at some point during the, I think several weeks into the campaign, Hitler was already giving orders to slow down armaments, armaments for the army, and redirect resources to the Luftwaffe and to the Navy, because he basically thought he had the Soviet Union beat already, and he was preparing for the next phase, which was going to be against Great Britain and the United States, even though we weren't at war yet. He saw what was coming down the pipe, or at least he felt that's what was happening. So the economy was not fully mobilized for war. They literally borrowed hundreds of thousands of factory workers at the outset of Barbarossa to fill out the army ranks, and with the expectation that it was only going to take a few months, as we just said, and they returned to their factories. Well, of course, they never did. Some of them obviously never returned to Germany at all, many of them. As we all well know, they had many shortages of critical natural resources, above all petroleum. And that's why at the beginning of the following campaign season in 1942, Hitler declared that if we didn't get some major petroleum producing areas at the end of this campaign, at least at Maikop and Grozny, if not all the way to Baku, which was really the main, the farthest to the south and the biggest production area. But if we couldn't even get some of the minor production areas in the Caucasus or the Trans-Caucasus areas, that he would have to make peace, which sort of stunned everybody. Obviously, that was another false prediction, but it was firmly rooted in the actual situation at the time. They were always running just at the edge of fuel exhaustion. Manpower shortages, I already mentioned that. There was the conflict between industry and the armed forces. The armed forces had huge voids they had to fill. They kept trying to go back to industry, but of course the problem was literally in December of 1941, when everything was clear that the Eastern Front was going to hell. The general in charge of industrial production had to declare that armaments production was actually going down. So it already was at an insufficient level to sustain a long-term war, and it was actually going down because of the raids they made on industrial workers. So because of that, by middle of 1942, there are no reserves in Germany. And there's practically none on the entire Eastern Front. No, I'm talking about army divisions. So I bring that up because one of the arguments that's come up many times that Brook made at the time is he talked about, in other words, in favor of a Mediterranean strategy over a cross-channel strategy, was that Germany could reinforce much more quickly, from east to west than from north to south. But it's really an absurd point, because there was nothing to reinforce with. The only divisions that were ever in Germany were ones that were transiting one way or another. So as you can see, the main thrust, the biggest parts of the German army were actually well below what you can see in the lower right-hand corner of that map. And they are a long way away from being ever going back to the West. And again, Hitler's under the impression, and he's in agreement in this case with most of his experts, that they need to capture oil, or they're going to be, they will not be able to continue the war in any meaningful sense in the following year. As a consequence of the manpower shortage, poorly equipped and motivated allies manned hundreds of miles on the Eastern Front, okay? Not just small sections, but there's two Romanian armies, an Italian army and a Hungarian army manning, and one of them, the two Romanian armies are on either side, or actually there's three Romanian armies, but two of them on the actual front. And one is on either side of Stalingrad. And that just shows the how short, or how overstretched, how overcommitted Germany was, because they never did that at any other point of the war. They never allowed their allies to occupy significant parts of the frontage for the reasons that became painfully evident in November, when when the Red Army broke through on either side of Stalingrad, broke through against the Romanian armies on either side of Stalingrad and trapped the Sixth Army in Stalingrad. So, and that was only the first. The next to come was the Italians. It's something we don't really know. It was probably the biggest military disaster of the war. Their Eighth Army was destroyed beginning about the middle of December. And then next came the Hungarians. Their army was destroyed by a Red Army attack in January of that year. So anyway, so moving back, that's the big perspective from the German side. And the British were not wholly unaware of it. They had extremely good intelligence. It's one of their great advantages during this whole period of time is their intelligence was extraordinary. I mean, I can take a map of the divisions with their boundaries in France and overlay it over a German map, and it lines up about 85% plus with the German map. So they have a very good idea. Whereas the Germans really, it's a black hole across the English Channel. So they're aware of this, and they also are aware of their superiority in the air. As Hitler had mentioned, that's one of his points that was founded in reality. And we'll go into a little bit why that was the case later. So Operation Sledgehammer, if you're familiar with it at all, you probably might believe was an American initiative because eventually it did become American. They did adopt it, but it was originated with British planning staff. You can see this is the first mention of the word sledgehammer that I'm aware of in the files. It's dated 10th of March, 1942, and the document behind it, which is a study of a cross-channel attack, or basically some of the questions related to its cross-channel attack is dated March the 7th. So it went through various operational objects were considered. And I want to also mention, this was something that came totally as a surprise. Even when I became aware of Sledgehammer, I just thought it was basically something that was on, a paragraph or something that some obscure staff person worked away on his little cubby hole. But actually, it was a subject of discussion of the British Chiefs of Staff numerous times over these months. I mean, it comes up again and again and again. And so as part of these discussions, they are constantly trying out new objects. So the first one is to cause protracted fighting in the air to reduce German air support available for the Eastern Front. Okay, so again, this is also premised on the superiority of the RAF at the time. At this particular point in time, there really aren't any significant American presence there, only some volunteers. Another one was to assist Russia in the early summer by diverting enemy sources from the Eastern Front. Another was to seize and hold a permanent bridgehead within the advantageous area of fighter cover. So there was some discussion as to, and so there was discussion basically in two different areas, the Pas de Calais and Cherbourg. Calais had the advantages, was much closer to RAF fighter bases, and they could effectively give air cover. Cherbourg had the advantages that it could be more easily defended once it was seized, because they would be defending like a less than 20 miles as opposed to over 65 miles at Calais. The lack of landing craft was identified early on as being a problem. So they also began working on a larger operation, which you may have heard of, which was called Roundup, which was supposed to take place potentially on the 1st of April of 1943. It actually was envisioned to be substantially larger than Overlord, probably along the lines of 50%. What happened in 1944 is that resources were scattered all around the world, just as the American Army staff had feared, and they couldn't generate the resources to make it as big. Well, obviously, it was big enough. So subsequent to this, I guess going back, I have to emphasize that basically you can, at first it seems that Brook is open to these ideas, but in looking at the discussions, it pretty much becomes a heads I win, tails you lose. You know, Calais, we can't do Calais because we don't have enough landing craft. We can't build up fast enough to hold the perimeter that's necessary. And in the Cherbourg, well, that's not so much the problem, but it's too far away from our fighter bases, so it's not going to happen. I think for political reasons, I think they felt as though they had to show they were doing something because the Russians or the Soviets were screaming for a second front, and obviously their American allies were pressing in the same direction. So along those lines, Marshall makes 2 visits to London, once in April with Harry Hopkins and a couple other people. And he brings with him his Marshall Memorandum. And basically around that time, Americans, they essentially adopt Sledgehammer and Roundup as their own, almost, as being the locus, where they saw strategy should go. He thinks he has them convinced in April, and I won't go through all the trials and tribulations, but basically in July, they see that the British aren't really on board. So he returns to London, this time with Admiral King, who surprisingly enough, even though he has the reputation as being, everything to the Pacific, he's actually argues strongly in favor of Sledgehammer. Whether or not he was entirely, sincere in that, I don't know. But I do think if you even look at it from his perspective, it's like, okay, we'll have Sledgehammer maybe this fall, we'll have Roundup early next year. And after that, all amphibious resources can come. There's not going to be any major need for additional amphibious resources. We might be able to take some over, but certainly all future production will go to me. So it makes sense from his standpoint as well. But basically the July talks end in deadlock. And since President Roosevelt has said we have to do something in 1942, basically they go to the lowest common denominator, which was gymnast, now recast as torch, which interestingly enough, Brook didn't really want to do that either. He would have been fine to not do that. But they did, for political reasons, they felt they had to do something. And obviously torch began, and that led to the whole Mediterranean Allied endeavor that you all know probably pretty well. So what were they talking about there in July? By the time they got into July, they had settled on the invasion area, and it was Cherbourg, and it was at Madeline Beach. I don't know if any of you recognize that area there. You might. It later became famous as Utah Beach. Why did that happen? Because the British planners at some point realized, well, gee, we can use drop tanks and extend the range of our fighters. Something in retrospect seems kind of obvious, but it's easy to know these things in retrospect since you know what happens later on in the war. And so now, essentially, we can keep as much fighter cover over the Cherbourg Peninsula. Strictly speaking, it's the Cotentin Peninsula, but they refer to it as Cherbourg, so I will too, as we could at the Pas de Calais. And so that's where the discussions were. That's where the state of the planning was. At the time, Marshall and King were in their discussions in July which terminated, I believe, was on the 22nd of July. So that's basically where I pick up the plan. It's an interesting academic subject to talk about in the abstract, but it's very helpful to have a specific plan to sort of validate the concepts against, especially looking at both sides of the equation. I'm sorry again for the green. Obviously, one of the objections that came up earlier in the discussion of Sledgehammer, even amongst the British, but post-war was, well, there wasn't enough landing craft. I know this is kind of hard to see. But basically, I think once you look at it, you will see there's a lot more landing craft in Britain than I think was heretofore acknowledged. And I don't know. So this is what the July plan, these are the numbers they had, which basically had 737, purpose-built landing craft and about 200 barges. And here's the actual strength in the UK waters. And when I say in the UK, this is not counting those in the pipeline that hadn't really arrived and combined operations bases, of which there were quite a few, actually. The pipeline was really rolling at this point in time. And this is how many I estimate would have been available if you take into consideration American participation, which the Sledgehammer plan, for whatever reason, they don't really leverage any American naval or amphibious forces larger than LCMs. So if you take that into consideration, which of course there was quite a number, because we saw what happened for Torch, where the Americans brought over close to 40,000 troops in amphibious assault amphibious ships. But they also have the advantage of having 930 barges, some of which were motorized and others had to be towed. So obviously those weren't ideal, but they did give an incremental capability that hasn't really been acknowledged. So I guess one thing I forgot to mention was that going back to the discussions in July 22nd and the plan that was on the table, basically it said that there needed to be a 10-week period between the go and when the actual operation could go forward. And I guess we don't really have time to discuss all this, but because they've been talking about Sledgehammer for so many months, there have been a lot of preparatory work going on. Okay, so for instance, not counted in these the barges is the fact that there are a number of other motorized barges that were made like workshops. So I know, for instance, Morrison talks in his book on Torch or actions in North African waters, that it would have been advantageous to be able to have repair facilities for the landing craft there. Well, they had those. They had dozens of them. And they also had self-propelled barges that were like basically gas stations where they could gas up on the other end. So that's just the tip of the iceberg. I just want to give you a flavor. This is not something that's just going to start from zero. Anyway, if you project forward from the end of those, the talks, assuming it, let's say they had gone the other way, the invasion date would have been around October 5th. And it also dovetailed with the Americans' demand at the time that something happened before the middle of October. So anyway, I don't really have a slide here on weather, but if you want to talk about it later, we can. I'll just suffice it to say that the weather records from both sides, which I have, both sides of the channel, show that October was, for the most part, just fine. And certainly October 5th, it was actually quite ideal. 5th, 6th, 7th, into the 8th. There was a little storm after that. But really, almost to the end of November, it's surprisingly favorable. So based upon those, and I won't walk you through the computations, but basically the estimated landing capacity would be 70 to 75,000 troops in the first 24 hours. And I say 24 hours and not D-Day itself, because it's clear from the planning that even though they feel they have an advantage in the air, it's not necessarily an overwhelming advantage. They don't really know the level of the threat. So they're going to try to do just basically everything under cover of darkness. Okay, so they're going to arrive offshore a little after midnight. They're going to discharge. They might have some other landing craft meet them to discharge the rest of the troops, and they're immediately going to head back across the channel, such that by 9 or 10 the next morning, they're almost back in port. So how does that break down? 5,000 airborne troops. Again, that's something you can't do for Torch, at least on that scale. They had a handful, but so that's including parachute plus glider. About 15,000 LCTs, because there was about 150 LCTs, and they planned on putting 100 on each one, which if you cross-check against Overlord, that's definitely viable. And about 50 to 55,000 on LSIs, or combat loaders, what later become known as APs or APAs in the American jargon. So does that seem like a lot? Well, let's look at it. Just 3 weeks later in October, assault convoys left ports with over 85,000 men bound for French Africa. So I think the 50 to 55,000, especially when you consider even at that point in time, there was a capacity of probably 3,000 to 4,000 and smaller LSIs that were left behind in Britain, presumably because they didn't have the range to get all the way to North Africa or whatever. But so I really think that's I think that's a very conservative estimate, and we can go into that more detail. But and obviously you have to realize, instead of going 2,300 to 4,500 miles across oceans of uncertain conditions, they only have 80 miles to go. And they can virtually be assured that the conditions are be good, because obviously the conditions are very unfavorable. They don't sail, as we saw in June of 1944. So, and one of the major advantages any cross-channel attack has is that there's a significant shore-to-shore logistical capability. So we've talked about the LCTs already. Of course, there aren't really any LSTs to speak of. There's like 2 or 3 converted ships that they use as LSTs. But Torch really has no shore-to-shore capability. And but between the LSTs and other vessels, which we're going to talk about in a minute, they had a substantial shore-to-shore. So that means all these small landing craft, the LC up to the LCM, can be dedicated strictly to bring. They don't have to divide their service between bringing vehicles and supplies across. They can be dedicated strictly to personnel movement. Okay, is that all on there? Yes. Okay, so what is the sort of secret sauce that they're going to use to supply themselves? 150 LCTs is good. It's actually going to be vital to especially get large armored vehicles across the channel, but also trucks on longer term. But in the short term, they really need LCTs. You can't do it with LCMs, really. They're going to use coasters. That's baked into the cake from the very beginning. And there's a lot of work put into that. Now that might seem a little rinky-dink compared to an LST. But if you actually look at the history of Overlord, coasters, as you can see here, were planned to be the backbone of the lift for the first 8 days, or actually 9 days, D through 8, and to continue as major carriers through D plus 21. Not only that, they demonstrated that they were able to keep unloading in weather conditions where other resources were not able to unload. Okay, so for instance, during the storms of June 19th to 22nd, they relied mainly on coasters. Later on the year, when nothing else would get down, coasters came to the rescue. So obviously, if you're a commander and you have your choice between a coaster and an LST, I guess, although it's somewhat, what I just said somewhat cuts against us, you would want an LST. But they weren't absolutely necessary. This is the one place in the world that a really major landing can take place against a strong opponent and not have a capability such as the LST, in my opinion. And I think I also have to mention that the coasters proved so valuable to the Allies. The whole idea is that they were going to take about 2/3 of the 1,000,000 tons that the Britain had in coaster vessels and use them for a few weeks to a couple of months, then give most of them back. But they actually didn't because they were just too useful. And they just gave a small, tiny fraction. And basically most of them served out to almost the end of the year. And as we saw even last week or last month, when Brian gave his presentation, he showed a coaster berthing in at Antwerp. So that's obviously late in 44. Okay, so what about Dieppe? What about Dieppe? Well, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but the defenses at Dieppe cannot be compared with the state of affairs on almost the entire rest of the coastline, Channel coastline, okay? Even at Dieppe, you see there's 6 landing areas, 3 inside the defensive zone and 3 out of the Dieppe's defensive zone and 3 outside. The 3 inside are just exactly as you know, they were, fiascos. But on the 3 landings outside, none of them had any problems getting off the beach because there was very little to no defenses at all on the rest of the coastline. The 302nd Division, another one of those 300 divisions, had about 50 miles to cover. They could not possibly be as strong along the entire coastline as they were at Dieppe. And we actually have in this case, I didn't even have to consult German documents. The British had somehow come into possession of them and had translated them in early 1944. So I didn't even have to translate them myself. We could see that that's what the German general said, just as common sense would dictate, and also as anyone familiar with German practice would understand, that they concentrate their defenses at the vital point, okay? Well, one thing I haven't mentioned, but in the Sledgehammer plan, they specifically reject a frontal attack on Cherbourg because that's likely where the Germans will be strongest, okay? So we have to make a distinction. Raids and invasions are not the same things. Raids have different political and operational objectives. And one of the main problems with raids is they're time limited. And that dictated the frontal attack, wisely or unwisely. And I also have to mention that all the planning on Sledgehammer was pretty much put to bed a couple of weeks, about 2-3 weeks before Jubilee. So there's no possibility that they were influenced. They quite understood, and they picked out Madeline Beach, Utah Beach, because they felt it was likely to be lightly defended, which it was. So I just don't, I'm sorry if I'm sounding a little bit impatient here, but I'm not with anybody in particular, but it's discussed so often. I just feel like such an obvious point that a well-defended, frontal attack on a well-defended position is, with modern weaponry is obviously extremely difficult, in this case, suicidal, but it can't be compared. If you look at Dieppe, they had right in Dieppe proper, they landed 2 battalions abreast, and that's exactly what the plan calls for here, 2 battalions abreast on Madeline Beach. Even if they run into those 2 resistance nests, they're going to be at least 15-to-1 advantage, and it's not the same, and the number of armaments are not even close. Terrain matters. Here's a picture of Madeline Beach. This is actually a post-war, but from the 50s. But it gives you an idea. You don't have the huge headlands that you had at Dieppe. Terrain matters in ground combat. I'm sorry I have to inform some of these historians that are ready to write off any cross-channel operation based upon what happened at Dieppe. Dieppe is not even 1% of the coastline. So it's not the same. And Madeline Beach was hardly unique. In fact, it's probably better protected than a lot of the other beaches along the French coastline, but as weakly as it was defended. So take a little bit of look at Dieppe. I'm just going to kind of look at real quick Sledgehammer versus Orville, just as a comparative tool. So, well, these 2 maps are kind of small, so I'm going to jump to. So this is Sledgehammer. This is a Sledgehammer plan overlaid with the German defenses. Okay, you can see right here. I don't know if you can see my pointer. Right here is the 17th Machine Gun Battalion. They're not even. They are really bottom of the barrel type of organization. They're responsible for this entire 10-mile plus beach line. Okay. But the significant thing is there's really nothing behind them. There's a big donut hole in the middle of this peninsula. And I want you to contrast that to 1944. And really, this is kind of misleading because there should be a lot more. You see these little black pennants? Those are battalions. And I didn't really, on this one, I listed all of the battalions, whether they were organic to the 320th Infantry Division, which was guarding the Cherbourg Peninsula. By the way, their frontage was 150 miles, 3 times what it was at the division covering Dieppe. And they also had a larger land front to cover. But anyway, I put every one of those little flags there. So imagine 20 more of those little black flags all scattered all through here. Okay, there was something like 28 combat battalions on the Cherbourg Peninsula on June 6th, 1944, where there was about 8 here. And most all of them are right here facing north around Cherbourg. It's a completely different animal than in 1944, okay? We could go, I do want to mention in passing, a lot of these troops were brought in literally 3 weeks before D-Day. This whole division was brought in, this regiment, which were excellent troops, and some other troops that were very good, were brought in just a few weeks before. So this is a German map showing the reinforcement, basically somewhat lining up with that. Sometimes the question comes up, well, they're all inferior to, they were just Eastern troops, but this, I'm not gonna really go into it because we're going long on this, aren't we? But it shows that most of them were German troops. Here is a map from the end of September. It's showing that there's zero bunkers have been built on Madeline Beach at this point in time. The A is what have been completed. Got one halfway completed one. German divisional strength in the West, okay? You can see much greater in 1944. Actually, this 50 is not correct. That's just in France. It's closer to 60 in the West generally. Okay, but you can see it's much greater, especially with respect to the top Panzer divisions and to other, quote unquote, first class divisions. Fewer defended troops. The terrain was more favorable to the attacker, at least on Madeline Beach, as opposed to Omaha. So again, here's a view of Madeline Beach, of Utah Beach. Okay, you can't really see this very well, but in the background, those are the cliffs of Omaha Beach. Completely different, completely different. That is actually more similar to what they found in Dieppe. That's why you saw the greater casualties. Not only were there more men, there were more machine guns, and the terrain was more favorable to the defense. That's why you saw something that resembles Dieppe, even though they did ultimately succeed. There are no beach obstacles, there's no inundations. Obviously, that wasn't a problem for the men invading, but it did affect them logistically. No artillery bunkers, zero in 1942. They're all open emplacements. The number of armored fighting vehicles, about 400 in 1942, almost 2,000 in 1944. No Tiger tanks, no Panther tanks. This was the Mark III. This was made up the bulk of the German tank force in 1942. They stopped producing it early in 1943 because it was obsolescent, but still most of their tanks were of this kind. None of these weapons here. I'm going to go through that. Okay, so I can see I'm running long here. I'm sorry. Somebody should say something. At first, I thought I was going to go through this too fast. So, so what about the Luftwaffe? So we already talked about the Luftwaffe, but just to get a little confirmation here, here's a few quotes from some experts. For one of the main experts, Williamson Murray, that basically, confirms that the Luftwaffe, like everything else, was dangerously overextended. Britain alone outproduced Germany in aircraft by 50% or more in each of the 3 years, 40, 41, and 42. The German Air Force only had 1,000 fighter pilots ready for combat during most of 42. I mean, never very much above that. While the RF alone had 6,000. Add to that there was an enormous fuel crunch, which I haven't really gone into, starting in September of 42, going well into 40 through October. At which point the Germans shut down 4 other fighter schools, so they couldn't really replace any there. Okay, so I'm going to go through this real quick. There's the other idea that the Americans improved amazingly between 42 and 44. But I think if you really look at it, you will see that's not the case. Here's a quote: "The lessons of Caspian Pass and Sicily had to be relearned at a frightful cost." And he's talking about in Normandy. The training never did improve, according to one veteran. They didn't even, train for hedgerow fighting. And again, I'm way over, so I'm going to just go over this very quickly. But there's many pieces of evidence that show that they had a long ways to go. So the Americans did improve after D-Day, after they got combat experience. So this is a quote from the 9th Division. It was one of the first divisions to come in after the initial ones. As a matter of fact, there were some lead elements on 6th of June. It had been recalled to service in 1941, so it had plenty of time to prepare. But its performance was so bad that basically they were thinking of breaking it up within a few weeks of the start of the campaign. But by the end of the campaign, Eisenhower numbered as one of his best divisions. Okay, so now we're going to wind this up. What was the opportunity? The opportunity, one, was that it would actually coordinate the East and West. I think the history of the Eastern Front sort of, there's kind of an ellipsis between the surrender at Stalingrad and Battle of Kirk's in a lot of Western history. But there's in fact an extremely important campaign in which, at which point the German army narrowly averted even greater encirclement than at Stalingrad that would basically would have ended the war. Any hope of them even continuing the war in any meaningful sense. And I make the point here is that even if Sledgehammer landing had just stayed isolated on the peninsula and hadn't brought any significant resources back from the Eastern Front. If they merely kept the divisions in France that were in France at the time, they would have had I think an outsized impact on the war in the East. And I think it's very likely that the loss in units would have been much greater, perhaps very much greater. I just want to show again, 42, 3, and 45, more divisions, better manned. Tank production way up in 1944. Production overall, all these lines you can see, the top one is tanks, so that kind of confirms the other one. But you can see production went up dramatically during 43 and 44. They were not facing a weaker enemy in 1944. There was more troops, more divisions. They were better equipped. They were better armed. There was just for instance, on the the Cherbourg Peninsula in 1942, there was only a handful of obsolete anti-tank guns on the whole peninsula, whereas in 1944, there's over 100 of very effective anti-tank guns. It's a huge difference. I'm sorry for the bad slide here, but this is the US tank production. You can see it peaks in actually the end of 1942. Why? Because they produce so many of them, they have nowhere to put them all. They don't need all these extra tanks. But it's a sort of vindication of the Army's position in early 1942 to say that despite these thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of tanks that they were producing, the US Army never had two armored divisions in contact with the enemy at the same time until July of 1944, a month after D-Day. This shows, it's kind of hard to read, but this shows the operational strength of RF. You can see it dips. This is without the effective use of the most powerful concentration of air power anywhere in the world, which was in southern England. They weren't effectively brought into the game, but even then, you can see at the early 1943, that's basically the nadir of their operational availability. And just as a note here, the same thing applies to the armored fighting vehicle strength of the German Army, which hit low on 1st of April, 1943, and actually peaked a month after D-Day and never really fell much below that peak because of the big production numbers. Even that's why the Ardennes counteroffensive was able to take place. All right, we're getting close to the end. I'm going to bring us back into the naval thing. I'm sorry I didn't leave myself more time, but it really does go back to naval strategy. The Allies had naval supremacy, but they didn't really exercise it. They didn't exercise it to its full capability. I know there's been this idea that amphibious operations are the most difficult to sustain, but if you really look at the experience of World War II, and here we saw some Red Army troops, coming off of a trawler. If you look at the experience of World War II, just about any combatant that tried to do an amphibious operation succeeded, at least in the minimal sense, that they weren't driven back into the water. Okay, you might dispute that, but we'll have some discussion on that. Okay, and here was their ace in the hole that I haven't really brought up the whole time, and that is naval firepower. That was the thing, especially given the geography of the Cotentin Peninsula. That was the sort of trump card that they always had. Now, truth be told, the original plans only showed a few cruisers coming through, I think because they still had the exaggerated fear of German air power, which I didn't mention. One thing I didn't mention with Dieppe is that that showed anything was that the Luftwaffe in France at that time was not anywhere much accordance with German expectation, had not nearly enough power to stop a cross-canal invasion. I mean, despite the numerous factors that favor the Germans, they only managed one bomb hit the entire day on a single ship. Anyway, so I do believe that after a period of time, or even just under cover of darkness, it's only 80 miles away, you can steam across far away and come back. And once you've established bases, air bases on the other side, which is part of the Sledgehammer plan, you can bring in at least your cruisers, and they can do a lot. I think that the universal experience of the Germans was that they could not really match up against Allied naval firepower. Okay, so I guess I forgot to say that was my last one. I have some more slides, but I already decided I was going to stop there. So sorry, I went about 20 minutes over what I was asked to do, but hopefully you found that at least interesting in some way.
Thank you very much, Gary. I found it interesting. I know that people have questions. I know that there are some differences of opinion out here. So I think if we segue right into the discussion period, that would be good. If you can go ahead and stop sharing your screen, we can move to the question mode. Great. And I'm not going to ask any questions. I'm going to leave it to the floor. Anybody who wants to ask a question, just go ahead and either put that little hand symbol up or raise your hand, and I'll try to get you in the order that I see you. So anybody have a question here?
I'm curious. I realize that the invasion of North Africa used many of the same troops we'd be talking about here. Looking at the Khotan Peninsula, would it have been possible for the Americans to land on the west side of that while the British landed on the east?
Well, if you look at the plan, that's something they took into consideration. I know I didn't really go into the weather aspects of it, but basically they rejected that on the basis of weather. The eastern, I know you hear a lot of discussions about how bad the weather is in the English Channel, which it really isn't, but there are periodic storms, and that causes swell, which of course the western coast of the Cherbourg Peninsula is exposed to the Atlantic Ocean. And then most of the rest of the coastline is eastern facing as well. And the prevailing winds, they're western facing, and the prevailing winds are from the west. So that was sort of one of the unique characteristics of the eastern side, was that it's sheltered from the prevailing wind. And that's one of the reasons why it continued to be viable to unload there, according to the weather records I have, right up longer than I think even the planners were hoping, which I think they were more optimistic than some of the critics have been at the time and since. So they just felt like it was the weather conditions that would make it possible to land on both coasts were just extremely unlikely to, first of all, it's just not likely to happen at all on the western coast that often, but at the same time as on the eastern coast, it just seemed very unlikely. And I think that's pretty much borne out. But yeah, they did consider that.
That would make things a lot difficult for the guys defending the peninsula to have people landing on both sides. Doesn't even take a whole lot.
Yeah, but I have to point out now, this is shooting forward into 1944, and this goes a little bit to my discussion about Operation Fortitude, pushing against an open door, and that is the 7th Army commander was constantly worrying about a landing on the peninsula, the Khotan or Cherbourg Peninsula, on the northwest coast. There is quite a nice beach there, but it is exposed again to the prevailing winds, and the Allies never considered a landing there. I don't even, as far as I know, there was no deception operation that tried to promote that idea, and yet he's putting some, even when in crisis situations, he's always reserving something in case there is another landing there. So in 1942, they had some defenses on that side, but it was pretty light. as you can see, they could see the eastern coast was
Well, I
more.
saw the airborne guys in there, and I figured that anything, even a battalion or two coming in there, would really throw a curve in there. The other thing that you didn't mention,
Yes.
which might be interesting, is you're now attacking.
By the way, they were going to be daylight drops. So I'm assuming they would have been right after dawn. They were not going to be, because there was no moon on that point in time. I failed to bring that up, but anyway.
The other thing I'd say, though, is you're landing very close to all the U-boat pens, which means that any aircraft you put on that peninsula make life really difficult for the U-boats, which in 1942 were causing you a lot of grief.
Yeah, and that's a whole nother aspect that I didn't have a chance to talk about. And that is basically both the German Navy and Rundstedt's chief of staff had hit upon the idea that if there's a landing in Normandy, it's probably again, diversions, right? Diversion. What would they be diverting for? Well, not for a real invasion in this case, but to like a super large raid on one or more of the U-boat bases in Brittany. Okay, so the Navy had already, greased the idea that hey, landing in Normandy, don't send a bunch of troops there. Don't take anything from Brittany, because that just means that they're going to be attacking our U-boats. Yeah. And as I said, it was in court, and that was pretty much bought off by Rundstedt's chief of staff. But interestingly enough, he was his chief of staff through about the end of September, at which point there's this major leadership crisis, a whole nother factor. There's many other factors that augur well for Sledgehammer at that particular time.
Let me break in here.
He becomes the chief of the general staff. He becomes Hitler's #1 advisor. His name was Zeitzler.
Yeah, Gary, let me break in here a little bit. Yeah. And there's a lot of ancillary benefits that were obviously attached to this whole operation, but there were a couple objections were raised during your presentation. I'd like to give an opportunity for those to be put forth so that you can address those. I'm thinking actually of Steve, who made those points, and I'm wondering if you would care to, Steve, if you'd care to bring them out to the group and have Gary answer them directly.
Yeah. Hopefully you can hear me now. I was muted before.
We can hear you. Maybe you can introduce yourself too, because I think.
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Steve Keffer. I'm an independent historian living in France. So this is after dinner for me. So and I've recently written a book on Cossack, Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Morgan, and the initial planning for Overlord that you can all look at through Naval Institute Press. No commercial endorsement, whatever. So I mean, I appreciate the presentation, and it's much more about Sledgehammer than I knew before, and I will admit that I am in the camp that never saw it as a particularly viable operation in 1942. There are a couple of issues. One is, first of all, the capability of the Allied forces in 1942 in the British Isles. American forces at the end of 1942 in North Africa were certainly not at a level of performance that would suggest that they could have gone against veteran German units, however thinly deployed they were 6 months earlier in France. How you supply people over the beach over a period of time. I know you addressed that. It doesn't seem like the capacity matches up with what the Allies would have had to put ashore in terms of armored divisions, in terms of a lot of things. The German Air Force won the battle over Dieppe. More British fighters were shot down than German. So again, it's not clear that air superiority, or at least ability to contest the airspace over Normandy in 1943, was a possibility.
You bring up a few points now. I'm going to start forgetting if you say any more.
Yeah, why don't you,
Okay, let me address the last thing first. They won the battle over Dieppe. Well, not really. It's not an attritional battle. The British could, you saw that the Germans only had 1,000 fighter pilots. They lost they lost 23 shot down, which is less than what the British did. Although the British, many of the British were fighters shot down, or aircraft, which were mostly fighters, were shot down by ground fire. There was no, if you had time to go through that list, there was quite a bit of anti-aircraft capability. Sure. Well, there wasn't any at Madeline, none. There was zero.
Well, again,
if you want to get into an attritional battle, if you read the best work on that, the greatest air battle, I believe is the name of the title. He comes to the conclusion if the Germans had to do this every day, they would have been driven into the ground, and they would have, because they didn't have the reserves. They didn't have any reserves. The British were going to start out with a 7.5 to 1 advantage in fighters, or the Allies, with 100% reserves. The Germans could not sustain any, if they'd lost 23 a day, if you extrapolate that over a month, that's almost 700 a month. They only had 1,000 fighters, period.
Yeah. Okay. I read
One other thing I would add.
And in any event, I think the larger issue
really the weather conditions are not
the political,
and that's probably another reason why the air part is probably not as important in that part of the year, even when the weather is that stormy, very often cloudy and overcast. So now you did mention about I understand your point about the quantity of storage to be brought across. First of all, I guess I failed to mention that one of the main objectives was to capture Cherbourg very quickly and bring that into play. Also, there's the minor ports of Barfleur and Saint-Vaast, which were used. And again, you can look at the experience. That's the nice thing about where it happened. You can see what happened during 1944, and they were used 100% coaster traffic. They weren't even big enough to get LSTs, but they ultimately had a combined capacity of 4,000 tons a day. Cherbourg not only had its facilities, but it had some beaches inside of the breakwaters, which the planners said we can use those beaches inside the breakwaters to land our landing craft. So the planners also said that the supply requirement is 500 tons a day per division. Again, you can cross-check that against experience in 1944, and I think that's quite right on the mark. They felt it only took 3 divisions to hold the neck of the peninsula, but the plan was to take up to 7, maybe even 8 divisions to hold that area. So that's 4,000 tons a day. I think it's getting a little bit into the weeds, but if you want to talk to me, we can go over the numbers with how much even the coasters could do over the beaches for a limited period of time until they could get the smaller ports first and then Cherbourg working. Again, it's very lightly defended at the time. So it's not like 1944. They're not going to have weeks to blow it up. They may have 24 to 48 hours. And I'm not even sure that they were primed to do that in 42 in the way they were in 44. I'm not sure. There was a third point you made? I can't really remember right now.
No, it's okay. I think one of the essential points is, for me, is the political will. The British were going to take on the majority of the effort, and from Churchill on down. Churchill in March of 42, in response to a proposal by the chiefs of staff for a smaller scale but similar operation made it clear that from his standpoint, there was to be no operation in France unless we intended to stay, we, the Allies, intended to stay, and there would be no effort against that unless there was a German defeat in the Eastern Front. In other words, they were not going to respond to a Russian cry from the heart for help, but to respond to a Russian success on the Eastern Front. And so I think that political stance would put paid to anything else that may or may not have been an advantage for Sledgehammer in 42.
Oh yeah, I totally agree with you there. So if you want to go from that standpoint, which is maybe even the most important, the political aspect is the most important. There probably was never really a chance for it to go forward, short of basically an ultimatum from the American side. Okay, I really mentioned Roosevelt because that's a whole discussion in itself. But obviously, you had the Soviets jumping up and down. There's a lot of pressure the U.S. could have brought to bear. They were going to have 3 divisions at the beginning. They had 3 divisions available. Had 3 divisions in Britain by the middle of August. Okay, plus the plan was to bring in 2 more a month starting in September. Of course, they didn't because there was no reason to bring any more in. There wasn't going to be a buildup for Roundup or for Sledgehammer. So they stopped bringing them. So by October 1, they could have had 5 divisions, 5 of the 7, 8, not that all of them would have deployed, but they could have brought in close to 3 or close to 3 from the very beginning. And so basically 50% or almost 50%. And then as time went on, they could reach the 50%. They probably would never have exceeded because there was a lot more trained British divisions in Britain at that time than obviously the Americans could bring over in over a period of months. And you have to realize, even though we think of 42 as really early, it's 3 years into the war, almost. October is, well, it's actually over 3 years into the war. So, and it's even if you want to mark, take your starting point as at Dunkirk, it's 2.5 years. So the British Army is completely rearmed. They're ready to crank down army production because they've already rearmed all of their divisions at the end of 42, and they don't really need the production anymore. So the Americans, I think that was really the point you made, and that was the point that Brook makes very unfairly, in my opinion, because of what I just laid out to you. It's right in the Sledgehammer plan, and I guess I didn't make this clear, but even though the Americans adopted Sledgehammer as their own, it was British planners who were doing this. It was British planners that are kind of the unsung hero, if you want to use that phrase.
And we all know that British planners are the best in the world.
Yeah, exactly. They did a really great job. I was really amazed. There were so many things I thought about, like, oh, I wonder if they could do this. I wonder if they could do that, before I saw the plan. But I'm always thinking, well, that's easy for you to say. You've read all the history of all the amphibious operations. You kind of know some of the things.
Well, when I was researching,
they figured them out.
Yeah, when I was researching Torch, I came across all the British planning for Sledgehammer, and like you, it kind of knocked me back. I thought, wow, I thought this was an American operation, but it wasn't, at least in its genesis. I'm
it's
sure
not strictly an American versus British thing, but at the upper levels, it is.
Yeah. There are more questions, John. You're muted. You're muted, John.
Yeah, I want to make sure I unmuted myself.
Okay.
There may be an echo in here. So I'm here as an observer.
Why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm here as an observer this time. This is my first meeting with you all. I just was recently hired as the education director at the MCRD Command Museum in San Diego. So out in the background, I actually have recruits that I can hear them sounding off with the drill instructors and so forth.
I'm glad they're paying attention.
Yeah, right. So I had 2 things. One, first and foremost, that issue of political will, because I was looking at, how Sledgehammer would fit into British overall strategy in the conflict itself. And I keep thinking back to British overall overall strategic objectives, looking at the Napoleonic Wars and so forth, and Britain seeing itself as an offshore balancer. It oftentimes doesn't go headlong into the continent, but rather nitpicks around the periphery. And I'm wondering if you have, on the one hand, strategic planning, but then there's that political will where the overall decision is saying, we're going to wait, we're going to bide our time, we're going to allow the Russians to actually wear down the Germans. The Americans, yes, we want to go headlong in, but do they have enough experience? So I think there may be some caution there in looking at that overall pattern of strategy. But the one question that I really had was, where did submarines come into the play? And again, when you're conducting amphibious operations, you have to maintain dominance over that entire battle space. And around that time period, 42 was probably the height of submarine activity in the Atlantic, where you have the most tonnage being sunk, from my understanding anyway. Again, you're the experts in naval warfare, but if that's the case, how much did that actually influence naval planners and say, wait a minute, we got something going on here. Can we really sustain the amphibious assault? Once you have the assault, you need to maintain dominance of that region, so that way you can continue follow-on forces, continue the supply chain and so forth. And if we have these submarines that are sinking ships left and right in the Atlantic, are we going to be able to do that?
So I guess you didn't sit in on last month's presentation?
No.
Okay. Believe it or not, the opponents threw everything at the, some of the British opponents like Brook threw everything they could against it, some of which I believe were spurious in the extreme, but they never brought that up because it's not a concern. Brian last month basically saved me from having to talk about it, but no, the Northern Atlantic route was substantially secured. Less than 4% of the cargoes that went on the North Atlantic route in convoy during this time period were lost to submarine. Okay. The Americans themselves, as part of their buildup for the longer term, were already in September bringing 8,000 tons a month. Okay. Remember, we're talking about maybe 8 divisions at 500 tons. That's 4,000 tons. Okay. Well, and the Americans only have to do half of it. So that's only 2,000 tons. So they well exceeded what they needed to do. And obviously, the British had plenty of production. Again, they had plenty of production. They just, shipping was always the big bottleneck. And the fact is, now they could leverage some, first of all, you're talking about 1/30 of the sailing distance to supply somebody across the channel, as opposed to in North Africa. So if you're talking about material dominance, why would you go to Africa? And you have a whole fleet of coasters that are otherwise not used in any strategic sense. And I was surprised to even see Churchill mentioned this in 1943 when he's because he wants to do everything. I mean, he wants to have the cross-channel attack in 43 and continue full bore in the Mediterranean, and which of course was not going to happen. But one of the things I was surprised to see was he's like, well, we can't bring our small, ships, into use to basically get all that production. Right up through 1942, Britain is producing as much war material as Germany. Now, you saw on that chart that I showed you before that their production took off in 43 and 44. But Britain still has a lot of production, but they're not really fighting that much. Even in the desert, even though they have a few divisions, a lot of which aren't even British from UK, they go for weeks, sometimes months, with hardly any fighting at all. So, this is the locus of the Soviet displeasure. You're not really doing very much. And if you look at it, up until June the 5th, 1944, the two great Western powers, the United States and Britain, only have a few divisions in contact with the enemy, a handful of divisions in contact with the enemy. And now it changes greatly the next day on June the 6th, or it starts to change. We know that. But I mean, that's not really, if you think about it, that's an argument that at least says the thinkers at the War Department, the U.S. War Department in early 42 had a point.
That's the other the other side of the argument. I mean, the other side of the political argument, I think, with the number of troops in combat. And just one more point. You look at Operation Torch, you had two armies go across the entire ocean, and none of the convoys ever even saw a German submarine. So are there more questions here?
If you ask the question about why do we go to North Africa rather than crossing the Channel, the reason we go to North Africa is there are no Germans there, and that kind of classic amphibious operations is hidden where they ain't. And I think that was kind of the logic of what the British were doing. I mean, I really thought the talk was interesting, and I thought I was very impressed by the kind of stats you brought in to back it up, and I thought the maps were interesting. I wasn't aware of the the actual tactics or what was envisaged in the Continental Peninsula in 1942 with the using Utah Beach in effect. But there were two things that I thought were I'd like to kind of press you on, right?
Sure.
One is the weather. I'm talking here from Scotland, and I mean, Steve lives in Angers in France, so he knows it as I do as well. But the winter, October, November, December, January, February, March, is not great weather in the Channel. I mean, it can be really, really rough. And I think there is a kind of campaigning season that I think goes from April to October, November. After that, it's very difficult. So I think that would have been one problem, and the other problem is I think there may have been 3 American divisions in Britain in the summer of 1942, but they weren't amphibious trained American divisions, and I think I think part of the problem that relates to that is that there are 2 aspects to an amphibious landing. One is like day one, when you take the beach. The other is what happens with the follow-on forces. The point isn't taking the beach. The point is taking the beach so that you can land follow-on forces. And there are no follow-on forces as far as the Americans are concerned in the UK in September, October 1942. I mean, there are some divisions, but there aren't trained divisions for the assault. And there are other divisions for the follow-on after the initial assault. So those are the kind of points that maybe you could help me with, because you had really good details of the German forces, right? But and the number of landing craft and so, which I think maybe are a bit exaggerated. But anyway, what I didn't see was a chart showing me, where are the American divisions.
Okay, so as far as the first point, the 1st American Division came across in August. It had at least 3 different maneuvers where it practiced landing. Okay, there was also the 3rd Division and the 9th Division that had substantial amphibious training. The 45th Division had just finished, but it obviously wouldn't have been able to come over in time. But I basically want to pick up on what you said, and that is basically, yes, you have the initial assault. One thing I failed to mention is if you look at the plan, one of the things they listed was there were 7 commando units available for Sledgehammer. I don't believe that includes the first U.S. Ranger Battalion, which was training under the commandos and would finish their training in the middle of August, so in plenty of time. So you had plenty of super well-trained troops to spearhead it. And after that, I don't really see the value in extensive amphibious training. Again, I can cite a bunch, for instance, something that Vince wrote about in his article just last month, I believe, Naval History, with the Russians taking the Kerch Peninsula, which they did. They didn't have any amphibious training. They didn't have any special built landing craft, and they didn't, as far as I know, they didn't even have any doctrine. They still made it work.
Yeah, they made it work by suffering
They paid
tremendous
the price.
casualties.
They paid the price. Yes,
Yes.
but the British do, and the Americans do have specialized landing craft, more than enough to overwhelm this very thin defenses on the eastern shore of the Cotentin. And after that, basically, you're getting in a boat and going over the beach, and then you're going into place and having a land battle. So obviously it's helpful to have some amphibious experience to get in on, you know, facilitate the speed of doing it, but you're not assaulting anything. It's all over. It only lasted 20 minutes in June 6, 1944. And I don't really anticipate it lasting much longer. Certainly it's not going to last into the next day. If it does, then there's something major wrong. So I think that's one of the things you said. What did you say? I'm sorry. Was there something else you want me to respond to?
Well, just to, I mean, you mentioned the number of trained American divisions and so on. Yeah, again, I think that, I mean, these people, you know, you're talking about divisions that have never been in combat. They're National Guard divisions. They don't do terribly
The
well.
first division is not a National Guard division. Neither is the 3rd, neither is the 9th.
They don't do very well in North Africa initially. And again, in North Africa, I think that's a good.
I mean, we could talk about North Africa. Do you like to talk about North Africa? That's a whole nother.
Yeah. Okay.
I did kind of hit on that a little bit, but if you would like to talk about it, sure.
No, I mean it's all kinds of problems come up there, and there aren't any Germans. You know, they're really they're trying to deal with a landing in an area where there are no German forces. They're Vichy French forces, and there are huge admin problems with getting their landing craft ashore. They lose a lot of landing craft due to breakdowns in November and December 1942. You know, given that it was essentially unopposed, well, pretty much unopposed. But
there's the weather conditions. Again, you can't compare. The weather conditions are ideal on D-Day and the 2-3 days afterwards, based on the weather records I have from the German side and the British side. Whereas you have huge ass waves, excuse the French, along the coast. You know, even Morrison says, he quotes someone else as saying, hey, we were asking relative amateurs to do what even experts can't do most of the time. It's not a comparable situation. Plus the beach situation is just, it's an ideal beach on the along the Madelon Beach and that whole side of the Cotentin.
Can I contribute something here?
Compared to the rocky, very surf intensive beaches that many of the Americans landed on. So
one thing that everybody takes for granted.
Problem.
One thing that everybody takes for granted is that the German troops are superior, let's say, to the French troops, to the Vichy troops. But I'm sorry, I think a 300 series German division wouldn't hold a candle against a French colonial division. I think the troops that fought in Morocco and in Algeria were far better than people think. And the thing of it is, they stopped fighting after one day, but they were on the verge of kicking the Americans off one beach after one day's fighting. So it was not a cakewalk. I think the Americans proved they could face.
That's Evan's point, is the Americans have problems even against the French. But
but the French were better than the Germans.
Vince. I mean, it's really the French that sprung the line in Italy in 1944. Those very troops that we're deprecating right now, they succeeded where the Americans, the British, the Poles, and whoever else couldn't do.
Anyway, that's just a point. But Bud, you had a question.
Yeah, Gary, terrific presentation, very thought-provoking. But my reading of strictly secondary sources is that not so much the competence of American troops, but the history of amphibious operations all the way through Vietnam, in which I participated, things never effing go as planned. And the other point I'll make is that the American generalship in the early years of the wars was not very commendable, to say the least. I just don't know that we could have pulled off a landing in 42, no matter what the data says before the operation commences.
Okay, so first of all, what's to say that the main attack comes against the Americans? Even if they're taking the 50% of the show, what's to say it comes against the Americans? And I think if you really look into the North African experience, it's quite a bit different than what the literature has you, or at least the conclusions. I'm not saying the actual facts. So for instance, let's look at Kasserine Pass, the so-called disaster of Kasserine Pass. Well, the Kasserine Pass was not the main effort of the Germans on the first day of the battle. Rommel was up the road at a place called Sabiba. And there was a very similar type situation where you had an Anglo-American group who put up a hasty defense. They just arrived, they just dug in, but they brought their artillery, and they were facing the 21st Panzer Division, probably the best division in North Africa, and maybe one of the best in the entire German army. And they stopped it in its tracks. That's why they don't talk about it. It doesn't fit the narrative. If you want to talk about how the Americans did against the Germans their first time in major combat, go read Rommel. He's the one fighting them. He was extremely impressed, especially by American artillery. And that would have been the key element in a defensive battle, as it was in most defensive battles during World War II, or many. I would say even most. Okay, yes, you're not incorrect in saying Americans had some problems. But first of all, they didn't get solved in Kasserine. They didn't get solved in Sicily or in Italy. That's I could have given you a lot more evidence, but I think the evidence shows that in 1944 there was not this great leap in ability. They basically had to fight the Germans once they got into Normandy. But the one element that was outstanding from the beginning in the American Army and also in the British Army, and we could go into the reasons why, but I don't want to belabor this, was their artillery. It was excellent from the very beginning. And that's the decisive weapon in defensive battles. So again, if you want to read about North Africa, go read the Rommel papers and see what Rommel has to say about his first encounter with the Americans.
Okay, that's excellent point. There are more questions here.
I have a question. Gary, I think this is very thought-provoking, and my thoughts are provoked. But one question I had about the operational concept behind Sledgehammer. I mean, you were just talking about the Allies fighting a defensive battle on the Cotentin Peninsula. Was the idea in 1942 that the Allies would basically seal off the peninsula and advance no further? And then I guess my question is, I mean, did that run the risk of creating in World War II sort of the Salonika situation in World War I, the largest self-guarding prison camp in the world?
Yes and no. I mean, really, from a strategic standpoint, I believe from Marshall's thinking that a Sledgehammer was his gambit to make sure that Roundup happened, to basically draw, he talked about the suction pump of the Mediterranean later on, but he wanted to create a suction pump in Great Britain or in Northern Europe, okay? So the fact that they might have been hemmed in, but just think of how many months they were hemmed in Italy or stuck on that line in Italy, or even in Tunisia. There's really not much motion between the middle of December and like April, except backwards for a while in February. So there's a stalemate. I don't think that from a political standpoint that's very difficult. But he wanted to make sure that Roundup happened. In my opinion, what's going to happen is, there is that risk. There is that risk that because they could saw off the one end. Well, the Germans could do the mirror image, but I don't think the Germans could afford politically. At least Hitler was not going to put up with that. He was going to constantly attack. And I think that's really the ideal situation for the Allies, that they can use their primary weapon, the one arm that they actually had a demonstrable superiority. Maybe it wasn't overwhelming, but it was. They had really good artillery, and that's great against attacking troops. It doesn't work as well when you're attacking offensively, because the other side is dug in and you can't hit them. But when they come out to attack you, they're out in the open. So I really think from that standpoint, it would play into the Allied strengths. But really, I can't really say what would happen for sure. There's little hints, at least on the American side, that they're looking past an initial thing. I do believe, at least by the end of November, when it's like, oh my God, the Sixth Army is surrounded at Stalingrad, they're going to fall apart. At that point in time, they're going to transition to something else. Now, is it going to be a very difficult situation? Yes, but the Battle of Normandy in 1944, if you look at the casualty rates, it's as bad as on the Western Front during World War I for a period of weeks. Okay, it was a bloody mess. And the Americans, I'm looking from the Americans, but even the British didn't exactly set the world on fire. They actually had the harder task, by the way. A lot of Americans don't give them credit. They stood up against most of the Panzer divisions. But anyway, the American British basically hacked and clawed away in their sort of semi-competent way until the other side collapsed. Well, they're much a collapse in late in 42, or probably more like early 43 by the Germans. Then I believe it'd be much harder for them to recuperate, just because the state of their production wasn't there. And I didn't really go into how, like, one of the questions you might have said was, well, you said at the beginning there's this competition between industry and the military over manpower, but you also said that there was more divisions later on, even though we know there was lots of casualties in between. How did they do that? Well, they did it by bringing in more people from more workers from the occupied territories, and most especially France. They brought in 2 million workers. They also brought in 700,000 Italian soldiers after the Volta-Pace, in September of 43. So more they brought. So what happens is you see less and less male German workers in industry, because they're going into the military. There was actually a pool of 5 million of them at the end of 41, but they couldn't bring any more out because they didn't want to cripple the armaments output. So they were able to bring in more and more people from outside, replace the German workers that then went into the army. Okay, but that took time. It wasn't going to happen in a matter of a few weeks or a few months. It took many, many months for that process to unfold.
Okay. Well, thank you, Gary. Are there more questions? We're going to have to wrap it up pretty soon, but I think this is going very interesting.
Can I ask just a quick factual question?
Okay.
No,
Second, Don. I'll get Evan first, then Don second.
Well,
just a quick question, and that is because it relates to the one before. You mentioned the Sledgehammer plan. Was there a Sledgehammer kind of follow-on plan? What do we do after we take the Yucatan Peninsula? I mean, is there in Normandy there was a breakout plan? We'll take Brest, and then that's the objective. But was there anything like that for 1942 Sledgehammer?
No, I think I kind of touched on that, but no, I don't really see anything in there. They're just hoping to capture it, hold on, build some air bases. And remember, the original objective was just to tie up the German Air Force and attrit the German Air Force. So that could have come into play. And also just to keep divisions in, one of the objections was it probably wouldn't have brought any divisions back from the Eastern Front, which is probably true because they were so short already. I mean, literally, I showed you how worried Hitler was about the Second Front. He's constantly wanting to bring more divisions back to ensure himself in France, but he can't do it. And literally, there's times where he gives the order on one day, and the next day they have to countermand the order because they're constantly timed. That's even before the disaster unfolds in November. So no, there really isn't. I do believe at some point there would have developed into something because of political reasons and everything. But no, there was no. It really, I think, in Marshall's mind, was his way of creating the suction pump in Northern Europe and paving the way for Roundup.
Okay, in other words, short answer is no.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Don, you had a point that you wanted to make.
Well, I had a couple of things. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I don't know if any of you have been to Dieppe, but I had a couple of occasions I was there, and if any of you have been there, the beaches are gravel, and the seawall is behind the gravel. One of the most memorable remembrances that I have is sitting on the seawall and listening to the waves rumble the gravel around. So I can see how the armor and other reinforcements came in and couldn't get ashore. But the other thing that I didn't hear you mention, and I apologize because I was delayed in getting in, but at Dieppe, the German coast artillery were right over the landing beaches. Unbelievable. And I didn't see in your later slides that you indicated coast artillery on some of the positions, but the coast artillery was there. One evening, I had dinner with Roy Murray, who was the commander of the Rangers at Dieppe, and they did not go ashore because it ground down too quickly. But the other thing, even at getting back to the coast artillery, the fellow that's always my guide at Normandy, Dominique Francois, his family farm was taken over for the what are the gun positions over Utah Beach? The name escapes me now. But anyway, the coast artillery could have certainly done some damage on the landing beaches, which is the reason that they were major objectives in the early attacks. Comments on the coast artillery?
All right. Well, a couple of things. Actually, there were a handful of Rangers. There's even a book called The Rangers at Dieppe. There probably 8 or 10.
Yeah, it was a company.
The Rangers themselves as a unit did not, yes, participate. But if anything, it shows the vulnerability of the coastal artillery that was in open positions. Because as you may know, if you looked, I think it was the Rangers.
Dieppe was
that. Orange Beach, right?
Dieppe was in bunkers above the beach.
Well, yeah, okay, yes, of course. Okay, you're talking about the ones that direct fire. Yeah, I did actually have a slide on that, but I think at that point in time, I felt like I was talking too much about, I needed to move forward. So, yeah, there was lots of direct fire artillery, right? Yeah, you didn't have that in most places along the French coastline.
But
coastal batteries, that's what you're talking about. They took one of them out with just one mortar round that hit the ammunition storage there and blew the whole damn thing up. And the other one, and this is where the Rangers did participate, only a handful of them got ashore, but they went and sniped at the other one and tied it up for an hour or so until they finally realized, they chased them away because there were just a handful of guys sniping at it. But you could see where it would be easily, it was so much harder in 1944 because they all were encased in concrete.
Exactly.
The ASV position that was bombarded continuously and never knocked out, I believe. I think it actually ran up in the ammunition or something on that eastern coast of the Cotentin. So yeah. It was much, again, advantage 1940. The other side's preparing too. It's not just you. They're preparing.
Yeah, exactly.
More questions?
One thing I haven't said is even though I'm giving you all these reasons, I'm not predicting that. Obviously, you can't predict something that didn't happen. I'm not saying it would have succeeded. I think there was an excellent chance it would have succeeded, but we'll never know if they'd gone forward because there's so many unanswerable things. I'm just basically giving you information, letting you decide for whatever that's worth. And I do think that it does cast light on the larger, discussion on, opening up the second front and that sort of thing. And, Western or the Anglo-American war strategy.
I think Hal just raised a point that I think is interesting to explore a little bit is always in military operations, there's risk and you take the risk in order to achieve a reward. You intimated with the situation on the Eastern Front that you felt that the reward in this situation would have justified the tremendous risk involved in Operation Sledgehammer. That's a fair thing to say, Harry?
Oh yeah, yes, and again, I'm trying to shorten things up, but that was one of the main goals. I mean, Eisenhower and Marshall are saying, hey, it's worth big risk. If it's the differences between losing the Soviet Union and keeping them in the war, even if the whole thing is, and believe it or not, there's even at least one high-ranking British general, his name is John Kennedy. He actually wrote a book after the war in which he completely disavows what I see in the documents.
Business of War? Yeah, it's a great
We
book.
lost everybody that kept Russia in the war. If the whole operation is a complete sell, and we lose all of our equipment and all of our men, and it keeps Russia in the war, or they refer to it as Russia, it'd be worth it. And of course, it would have been. They were taking a huge risk that Russia wouldn't be knocked out of the war, because they really didn't know exactly how well they were going to be able to do. So obviously, in July and August, things didn't look that great.
Well, I kind of agree with that in many respects. I think this has been a fascinating discussion. I think one of the things that interests me so much in these sessions is to explore narratives that have been established and that we all kind of take for granted, and to look at it, from a different perspective. And I think the whole feasibility of Operation Sledgehammer in 1942 is one of the strongest narratives of the war, at least as far as the United States and Great Britain are concerned. And so, as with any narrative, it's worthwhile to take a look at things. And I really appreciate the way that you've done this, Gary. I appreciate all the research you've done. I appreciate all the time and attention you've put into this subject. And we've obviously had our discussions about it, so I'm more aware of that than perhaps the audience is. But I thank you very much, and I think this has been an excellent Q&A, and it kind of gets to the heart of what I'm trying to accomplish with these sessions. So thank you very much, Gary. If anybody has a final word to say, I'll let you say it.
There's also been an active discussion in the chat if anybody's interested.
Or about the aircraft carriers.
Carriers and aircraft and how that might have played or not played.
Yeah, well, one of the big question marks is why were there no carriers involved in Operation Overlord, D-Day? And obviously the answer is because they weren't necessary. But was it a resource that went begging, that could have been used and provided a good service? And that's another thing that we'll never know about. And somebody might want to talk about
for
that.
Overlord, it would not have been so handy because it was further to the east, and the carriers would have had to stay out in the Atlantic. For the Cherbourg Peninsula, they possibly could have got in. I just simply took the carriers that we sent to North Africa and said, how would they do off the Cherbourg Peninsula?
Mm-hmm. Maybe that's a future topic. So, okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up now because it is 2:00, and Gary, you've accomplished the record of having our longest Q&A here. So, and the fact that we still have 21 people attending is testimony to how interesting this has been. So thank you very much.
Well, thank
you everybody for
listening
attending.
to me and putting up with me.
Presentation.
Okay, well, thank you.